Yo guys, and welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about Destiny 2. I know that's not really something we cover very much on our channel. We do more focus on games like Lost Ark and, other MMOs and stuff like that. But technically, Destiny does kind of fall within that MMO framework. And so I do want to talk about it. Something personal in my life came up. And so I was going through and exploring some of the portal from the standpoint of somebody who, one, hasn't played Destiny in, maybe a little bit less than a year. And two, as somebody who didn't buy Edge of Fate, their most recent expansion. And so I wanted to talk about my experience with, in particular, the portal. I know a lot of content creators have been talking about it lately, and actually, the community has seemed pretty mad and pretty upset about the portal. And I think part of that is justified, but not all of it. So let's jump right into it and have a discussion about it. So, coincidentally, the very next day after I was recording a lot of those clips, Paul Tassi dropped his video talking about how he just can't get behind the portal. And on his thumbnail, right, he says the portal is the problem. I really don't think the idea of the portal was the issue. I think it's the execution. And there is a difference, right? The idea behind the portal, at least from what I can tell, is one, they really want to reuse the content that they have, likely because the game is in maintenance mode. And so because of that, they don't have the ability to develop a lot of brand new activities and stuff. But two, to let players chase higher tier, better loot by taking on harder difficulty challenges. So I think that there's a lot of merit to that. And I think genuinely that's a really good idea and a good place for Destiny to go. But again, it's the implementation of that, which I think was wrong and could use a lot of work, as we'll talk about later in the video. So welcome to the portal. So this is what the portal looks like if you're a player like me who has not bought Edge of Fate, the most recent expansion. So what you'll see is it is kind of, there's not a lot going on here, and it is pretty easy to see some of the major things that you're going to be interacting with, including the seasonal hub, the tower up here, and then the different playlists and activities down here that you can get. So in here in solo ops, we have access to our solo ops playlist. We only have access to the normal version, but you can see it has a forecast here that kind of shows us what we are going to have available to us with our B ranking for this difficulty of an activity with these particular modifiers, right? And so we don't actually have the power yet to do these other higher ones, but if we switch to Solo Ops Skywatch, for example, we can actually customize this ourselves. And by going through, we can add challenging modifiers and then boon and event modifiers as well. So for example, we can add caltrops. Caltrops will appear on combatants. Affected combatants drop damage elementals pools during combat and after being defeated. So you can see that this will add a lot to our score over here. So the more things that you're modifying and changing in here, the higher your possible score could be, which will end up increasing the value of the loot that you get. Now, from a player standpoint, this is really, really cool. This kind of feels like you're getting that behind the scenes look that maybe the devs get when they're like testing or doing other stuff like that. It really feels like you have a lot more control over the kind of activity that you're going to play, and then also your rewards, right? Because you are ultimately probably doing this to try and get the rewards from this system. And that's kind of where the cracks start to appear. The reason I say that is because if we go and have a look at the details for the portal activities gear, you'll see that it's pretty limited. The actual gear that you can obtain from doing portal activities, which to my knowledge is the only place to get tiered loot, is going to be pretty limited. From my understanding is that the most recent thing that was added to the portal was the dungeon lairs, and in those dungeon lairs you have access to the old dungeon loot, but not in the tiered system, which apparently many players were not understanding, and understandably so, because it would seem to me that anything that goes through the portal should be giving you that tiered loot, and maybe there are other engrams available. But the point being is that these tiers actually really have a lot of value. And if you take a look at it, you'll see right now I'm looking at like tier 1 gear, and that's what I'm able to obtain at my level. But at tier 5, you can get 2 enhanced traits, 3 multi perks, and then enhanced mods, magazine, barrel, origin traits, as well as cosmetics. So realistically, if you're playing this game, you're probably chasing this tier 5 loot. And so anything below that is really going to feel like it's less than, right? And if we go back, what you'll see is that I don't actually even have any way to obtain that tier 5 loot. I have to first increase my score, my power, so that way I can do these other activities. And by doing these other activities, I will finally be able to boost my score high enough. I will be able to obtain that tier 5 loot. And I think it's worth mentioning that realistically, while I say that, Destiny kind of leans a little bit into the MMO stuff, it really is a looter shooter. And so without loot, there's not a lot to do. And so as you can see, like I said, it kind of is showing a little bit of the cracks in the armor here. And the fact that we don't really have access to get that tier 5 loot until we get much, much higher. Now, for reference, I'm actually at 65 power, and that is roughly, I want to say, probably 6 to 8 hours in. And that's not a good thing. This means that, realistically, I'm going to be here for a long time before I'll be able to start earning some of that really powerful tier 5 loot. And I think that's just a genuinely really bad thing. And the reason for that is because why play this game if you're not going for the loot? I understand, eventually they're going to add, additional loot to the game that is going to be, additional ways that you can upgrade tier 1 to tier 2, etc. I'm not sure if that's going to be so you can upgrade from tier 1 to tier 5. Hopefully it is, but it does kind of mean that every piece of gear that I get at this level is worthless. And so that's kind of a hard pill to swallow, especially when you first start playing. Now, I'm not saying you should first start playing and then be getting the best loot in the game. That wouldn't make much sense. But given the fact that this system has been put into a world where I already have a build and my character already has pretty good gear with decent weapons and things like that, it's not like I'm a brand new player playing this game, but because of the power level system, that's the way I'm being treated. I have very good gear and even a proper build, as I mentioned, but the game is under the impression that I'm a new player, and so I only have the ability to obtain tier 1 loot. So again, it's really kind of at odds with itself. I really like the idea behind the portal, the idea that you get a lot of control over your activity and what you're doing, and that you can get better gear by pushing harder, pushing farther. That's all well and good. But what's not good is this really weird and odd barrier to entry. Now, had this system been launched alongside a brand new game in Destiny 3, maybe it would have gone over a little bit better. But ultimately, you will still have that extremely long time gate to be getting some of those end game rewards, no matter how good you are or how confident you are in your build or your skill, right? And also for reference, I think I looked it up online a couple of months ago, and it was originally clocked, I think, at 120 hours of playtime in doing a solo mode activity to be able to actually get the loot that you need to get high enough level to get tier 5 loot. That is an insane time gate just to start earning some of the better items in the game. In a lot of other games, they'll definitely give it to you a much earlier time and you'll be able to use it even if you can't keep it forever. But like games like Diablo or whatever, sometimes you'll get those high value legendary much, much earlier. Sure, you won't be able to take them with you to end game, but ultimately you do get access to some of that cool and fun loot that gives you, well, that dopamine hit for sure for getting the cool, fun loot, but also the ability to kind of start to imagine, how it's going to look. You start getting legendaries that have different effects and you're like, oh, that's a really cool effect. Maybe I'll want that later on down the road. When you're looking at this tier 1 loot, it's very hard to get excited about it or even have a general idea of where it's going. Now, in a weird way, a system from Destiny Rising could be a good fit for this because I don't even know without looking up online what, what this could roll. Is this a good roll? Maybe it's not a good roll. I don't think it's a good roll. But without looking it up online on Light GG or something, I don't even know what the possibilities are for this. And that in itself is a huge problem, especially if you're not going to be giving any of that stuff that's starting to make me think and make me excited about build crafting in the future. And also, on a fairly relative different side note, why is this back? In what world does it make sense that we get blue drops again? This feels really, really weird. This feels like a throwback to back in the day when we would get really annoyed by getting blue tiered loot. Now, again, maybe as a brand new player, a brand new light, this blue tier loot might be somewhat interesting. But to be honest, as somebody who has experienced this game, the blue loot feels like a slap in the face because we waited a long time for this to be out of the game entirely, to not see it anymore. And instead, it's back. Why have these drops in the game? It feels weird. It's also unintuitive to a player who's brand new to the game that this is worthless and that they shouldn't be using this long term. They should pick something like this that has, proper stats on it or something, and then they can actually, fuse this in over time, but just using it as infusion fodder. A weird, tangent, but I wanted to talk about it because it, like I said, it feels like a slap in the face as a player who's played this game before. And honestly, while I was recording that last part about the blue, I didn't even know I got a tier 2 at some point, and I don't know where this came from. I'm not a brand new player to the Destiny franchise, but I don't even know, like I said, where I got this loot from. So I think that in itself is kind of part of the problem. How can I be this many hours in and I'm not sure where I obtained this from? Yeah, so after looking around a bit more, I'm not actually sure where I got this loot from. And I'm continuing to look around more, and I'm noticing small things that don't really make sense to me. So I don't really know what this 3 means, but if I click on this, it still says a tier 1 engram. So I don't know if this means I'm supposed to get a tier 3 engram from this, or if it's 3 times this tier 1 engram. Whatever the case may be, there are small problems with the UI when you're in this part of the UI that probably could use a little bit of work. Either way, it doesn't really matter too much about figuring that out, and that could just be a fact that I'm still relatively new to the system and trying to figure out how I, am still obtaining this stuff. I do think that, ideally people have a better idea pretty immediately within the first hour or two, but I'm willing to kind of overlook that, and I think that eventually I would definitely figure it out for sure, just by trying to track what drops I'm getting from where and stuff like that. Something else that I think is worth talking about too is that things like these solo ops, so for example, this quick play normal list, the amount of variety that's available here is not very much. It's a few missions from what I can tell, and I believe a couple of them I've played twice now. And like I said, I've only been playing for 6 to 8 hours. So realistically, if I'm just doing the same missions over and over again and I'm already feeling like it's a bit repetitive, then I think that that's probably not a good sign, especially when they only take 5 to 6 or 5 to 10 minutes. I believe on average for me, I was doing them in anywhere from between 5 and 6 minutes a run. So pretty quickly overall. So maybe that has something to do with it. Regardless, I'm still not even power level 100 yet. And the goal is eventually to be much higher, right? We need to get 400 at least so we can start doing the Grandmaster activities. And I believe people were saying online that 450 is where these activities start to drop the tier 5s. So it means that we're several, probably tens of hours at least, even if that 120 hour, from Reddit a few months back is not accurate. But that's kind of assuming that we're also getting the right slot and that the speed that we get this stuff doesn't decrease. And that kind of brings me into the next thing. If we go back and we look at the fire team ops, what these are different activities, but look at the time investment. So here, what you'll see is this takes 10 to 15 minutes. And what I found was that doing this with other people was much slower than my solo ops experience because I could just fly through it so quickly. Now, clearly, that's just a numerical balance issue, but this kind of game should really, really reward you more for playing with other people than it does by itself. And so that really probably needs to be addressed right away. In my opinion, because this takes 10 to 15 minutes rather than the other activity that took 5 to 10 minutes. And again, this was like 5 to 6 minutes for me on average. The fire team ops that should be, 10 to 15 minutes, even if we go on the lower end of that, it should be at least twice as rewarding as the other. But realistically, because you're playing with other people and it could take potentially, 3 times as long as the other activity, it would make sense to me that this should give you at least 3 times the loot, at least. And I'm assuming, based on the activity that I have run with it, it has like more intricate boss fights that have, more damage phases and things like that too. So like this activity genuinely does take longer than doing the other activity and has a lot more time gates even within the activity. So again, it would make sense that it would be significantly more rewarding than the solo ops playlist. So to kind of break it down again, the portal has repetitive activities. It seems like a very small list of loot pools that you can get from these activities. And then on top of that, a really, really long time gate to be able to obtain gear that's at least on par with what I had before as a returning player. So, maybe I think they said tier 3 was roughly at the point where, we were before this new system came into the game. But if that's the case, why am I wearing and using all tier 3 gear and only able to earn tier 1 and maybe a few tier 2s here and there? It's a very weird disconnect that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And like I said, maybe this is specifically, targeted this experience for like brand new lights, but then it doesn't make sense why I'm being thrown into it. I think it's really worth mentioning that if we take a step back and look at it really objectively, the idea behind the portal could be really cool. The reason why I say that is because the portal, at least to me, looks like the devs were trying to find a way that one simplifies everyone's interactive like user face experience, because definitely, and I get it, that the world, this was a pretty confusing thing for a lot of people when they would first join the game. That totally makes sense to me, and I get that. People would not know where to go for different things other than these few little buttons up here. And then going to each planet individually would be, more of a mess. But this would allow you to kind of experience any of those other pieces of content and be able to add those modifiers, change your experience, and then also increase your rewards. But it doesn't really feel like it's increasing my rewards, at least at this level. It feels like I'm definitely locked to getting tier 1, maybe tier 2 stuff occasionally, but it doesn't feel like that. Actually, I don't have the freedom that I, was expecting from this system. But again, the idea behind it, I think, is that you're going to have that freedom and that you can use that freedom to kind of play the way that you want. And I love that. As a player, I love that. And I think it's such a great thing. But it's very clear that this was a system that needed longer to cook. It needed more activities. It needed a better understanding of player experience when they jump into this system without maybe Edge of Fate or just in general. And then understanding how players who played the game previously were going to feel about the loot that they're getting when it's worse than what I had before. All of these different things kind of compound and make it into a not great system. And I think one that many people don't understand is ultimately a good system, but it's just very underdeveloped and very bare bones, right? It just needed a lot more work. And so over time, I imagine that the portal will get to a place where it's going to be a better system. A lot of these things can be numerically balanced, whether that be drops or, looking at rewards. I also don't really understand the fascination with the power level grind. When at least my understanding of it is at endgame, you're going to a higher delta to give you the higher loot. So they want you to get to like 450 or 500, and then they want you to play an activity that's negative 50 power. So why lock a system like that, or why lock that experience behind that? Why can't I just play at negative 50 now? It doesn't really make any sense on why I don't have the ability to do that, other than they're trying to either one, not allow brand new lights to get access to that system for some reason. Maybe it's cheaters, maybe it's, they don't want to overwhelm players by giving them something potentially too hard, or you know which, to be honest, this is what feels like the case to me. It feels like they're just trying to lock it behind an additional time gate, so that way I'm forced to play 100 hours or whatever to get that gear. Something I think it'd be worth clarifying too is that if the intent behind the level ranges on there is that eventually you can over level and make some of those negative 50 pieces of content easier, they can go about that in other ways as well. They don't have to just make it so you can over level in this way. They could make it via the artifact level or something that would combat the negative modifier. They don't need to just make it so that way when you hit these different thresholds, it's based upon that threshold. So it's not like they need to only go in this direction with how they're currently doing their leveling system. This is just the direction that they did choose. And, maybe it is designed for that reason in mind, to make it so that way it's easier for people to obtain, the tier 5 gear. Even if they're not the best player, they eventually can get them by overleveling. Again, there's just other ways that they could go about doing that. This just happens to be the way that they thought about doing it, which I think is definitely it's something that has drawbacks on the rest of the game. Because, like, let's not get confused here. I can grind solo ops, and I know for a fact that at the end game, they were doing this as well, just grinding solo ops by themselves just to be the most efficient. I believe it's this one here, the Caldera solo ops. That shouldn't really have ever been a thing. And again, there's no need for it if you're just doing a negative delta anyway. If no matter what my power is, I'm going to be fighting enemies that are, 50 power stronger than me, then why do I need to be at 450 or 500? They can just be at 50 power stronger than me now. So again, it feels like the idea behind the portal is really cool. And I think it has a good start, a good foundation for having people have more control over what they're doing and potentially their rewards. But it feels like the rewards aren't right. It feels like the amount of content that's here is too small. It feels like it's too punishing as someone who could potentially do those negative 50 grinds much earlier, but is, going to be forced to do tens, if not, over 100 hours of grinding mindlessly for no reason. These different things, like I said, they just compound and they just feel weird. They feel strange. And it doesn't make me excited to log in and play. So once I kind of got a feel for what was happening, I really stopped playing, to be honest. I was doing this to try and just be really responsible and try and get a good understanding of it. But it's such a turnoff doing these activities and doing this grind just to make number go up. If I was getting tier 5 loot along the way, maybe it wouldn't be that big of a deal, even if it was, somewhat sporadic. But it would be hard to manage that, because if it's too few and far between, it's going to lose its interest much earlier. It's hard to tell. If I was getting loot that was like still good, but like couldn't be upgraded to tier 5, I also wouldn't be very excited about it. Like if I was getting tier 4s, but I can't upgrade them to tier 5s eventually, and then, what's the point of a tier 4? So it's in a pretty rough spot. And I think, like I said, it just comes down to this needed more time to cook. It genuinely did. And I'm sure over time, a lot of these things will get figured out. They'll get ironed out, but it's going to take a little while. If I had to guess, I would say, in 8 months to a year, the portal will probably look quite a bit different, and will have a lot of the updates that it needs to kind of make this system feel a lot better to the player base. But this was how the first impression went. And so for a lot of people, a lot of players, first impressions mean a lot. And so I wouldn't be too surprised if a lot of people played with the portal, said this sucks, and moved on, you know? So I think that that's definitely part of the problem that this game is having right now, is that the portal just needed more time. And unfortunately, it wasn't given it. Okay, so I think it's worth talking about what I would change in the portal. And there's a lot of different facets to my experience that I want to try and tackle here. So there are some bigger things for sure, but there are some smaller things that I don't think would take as much dev time that maybe they could hit on sooner rather than later. So, kind of starting off with the two biggest things, I would restructure the way the portal works. And instead of having this, you know, all these different activities, solo ops and playlist ops and stuff like that, I would just make it so that way people are interacting with each other and there's like a 3-man activity and there's like a 6-man activity queue. Now, you could keep, I guess, solo ops, but also take some of the changes that I'm going to talk about in a second. But the point being is, I think that it doesn't really make a lot of sense to break up the portal, maybe as much as it is. And I think people like playing in 3-man and 6-man activities anyway. And so this emphasis on rewarding the single player with the same amount or better even than the fire team doesn't really make sense. I think that they should lean further into the fact that you're playing with other people and really make these activities, so one, match made, but two, just like fun, right? Like I want to queue into an old menagerie run or something. You know, it could just use old activities that were available in previous seasons, for example, or, you know, whatever, strikes even for the 3-man activities. Some of that stuff obviously got content vaulted, but there's no reason why they couldn't just bring them back and then just put them into the playlist. So I think it would be worth trying to reuse some of their assets. If they're not going to have the bandwidth to make new activities, this would at least really give them a large library that they could kind of pull from, and then, you know, apply, you know, the next thing that I was going to say, which is basically just setting it up so that way when you go to queue an activity, instead of having to completely customize your experience, I would think that they should make a baseline one that is available in all the activities that maybe just rotates and gives you the tier 5 loot, or potentially like tier 4 and you could upgrade them to tier 5 depending on the difficulty, whatever the case may be. But I think having different options for people to just be like, okay, I'm loading up the 6-man activity, it's the menagerie this week, and I want to go for tier 5 loot, and then boom, I can start the activity rather than having to play with the modifiers and stuff like that. I feel like I understand after the 6 to 8 hours roughly some of the modifier stuff, but it does kind of feel like it would be nice to be able to just jump straight into it. I like having the power to be able to change my experience if I want to, especially if I'm playing with a fire team that I already know. But when you are trying to do this with Fire Team Finder or whatever, you might run into issues with, you know, people don't want to play with the same modifier or whatever. And so having a thing where people can just queue it up and then launch the activity immediately and it would just find people to play with, I think would be a lot better in all of these different portal activities. And again, I would do this for the 3-man activities and the 6-man activities, and kind of more or less just move stuff away from there. You could have like a dungeons playlist if you wanted to, or even potentially a raids playlist. I think Destiny Rising has really opened the door and made the possibility of matchmaking even raids and harder activities completely fine, as long as there's like a proper like progression system. So going in and doing the Gauntlet Ops Blitz, if you've done Destiny Rising, to be able to unlock the Gauntlet Onslaught kind of makes sense, and the fact that you're learning a little bit on how to do some of these mechanics. And so then you don't have to worry as heavily about matchmaking these raids. Obviously, Destiny 2 has, you know, more complex stuff, but to be honest, I think in a lot of cases you could still do it and it would work out okay to some degree. A lot of times people are going to probably make a fire team themselves anyway, and so that doesn't really hurt them. It just gives players who are maybe solo players the opportunity to go and do this activity, especially if you were to involve the like exploration system that they had taken previously from the last event last summer, to do the like dungeons and stuff like that, where it shows you like tool tips on how to do it and everything like that. I think that was a great system, and I'd love to see them expand on that and find a way to add that to the portal, to these matchmaking dungeons, just to make it so that way people who haven't maybe been able to do some of these activities before could get in and, really start to enjoy what's available in Destiny 2. Another thing I would do would be to restructure the power grind. And by that, I mean kind of get rid of it entirely. So it doesn't really make sense to me. And it kind of never really has that, like, leveling in Destiny has always felt a little weird. At least for now, you're leveling higher so that way you can get access to different levels of activities that make you chase a different higher delta, which essentially means that you're leveling up to get underpowered. Like, you're powering up, you're leveling up to be underpower further to get higher rewards. It's like a weird double negative. It doesn't really make sense. And so I would lean further into their idea that doing harder content gives you better gear. But I think there's no reason why they couldn't just do that from the start. They say every player is X power level, and then from there, the difficulty of the encounter, they'll be so much higher above you. And that's kind of it. I don't think there's a need for the power grind. And right now, I think the player base is kind of showing that people aren't really interested in doing that power grind. And even Glad talked about it. The power grind is very boring, especially right now, the way that it's balanced. And to be honest, I don't think that balancing the drops should be the priority here. It doesn't really make sense. I'm not sure like that the power grind is adding anything other than artificially time gating how long players have to play the game, no matter how geared they are or how skilled they are, before getting those tier 5 pieces of loot. So I don't think that it personally is needed, and I think it's just adding more friction to the player base than I would actually recommend doing, especially when numbers are looking the way that they are, and Destiny does kind of feel like it's a bit in maintenance mode with not a lot of people able to dedicate a lot of extra time to the development right now. So I think it would just make a lot more sense to do that, and then allow players to lean further into the idea that you can chase your own difficulty and get rewarded for it. And lastly, maybe, probably the most important thing, but it could be a lot of time depending on how it's implemented in the back end, is making sure that all of the activities that go into the portal are dropping their upgraded loot. So if a dungeon goes into the portal, or if a raid goes into the portal, and it's part of the portal playlist for that activity or whatever, its loot needs to now drop at the new tiered system. I hope that the portal can get the love and time, the development that it actually really needs. I do think it can eventually be a good system and that people will really like it someday. But it does need time for sure. If you guys like the video, leave a like down below, add a comment if you want to talk about anything or have any questions or anything. Feel free to ask anything. I always am paying attention to the comments and always happy to respond. If you guys like the video and want to see more stuff like this for other MMOs and other games, we cover a lot of Lost Ark and pretty soon Blue Protocol. So feel free to subscribe down below if you want to see that stuff, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Have a good one. Peace out, guys.